We'll turn to our business segment now with our editor, Charles Pellegrin. We're going to begin at the G20 finance ministers meeting in India, where the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has called for rich countries to speed up debt relief to developing nations. Charles.
That's right, Aaron. Yellen added that half of all low-income countries are near or in debt distress. And this corroborates the findings of a new report by the United Nations Development Program, which highlights the real human cost of inaction on this debt crisis, as countries have to dedicate more resources towards paying off debt and have less left to invest in development. According to the UNDP, 25 developing economies spent over 20% of their government revenue last year on debt servicing, the highest such figure since the 2000s. In parallel, the consecutive economic shocks that were the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have brought an additional 165 million people into poverty between 2020 and 2023. So to discuss this issue further, we can talk to the head of the United Nations Development Program, Achim Steiner, who is joining us live from Gandhinagar in India, where that G20 finance ministers meeting is taking place. Mr. Steiner, thank you very much for being with us on France 24. First off, can you give us a sense, beyond the numbers that we just gave, of the difficult situation highly indebted countries find themselves in when it comes to investing in development programs?
Certainly, and I think it is also one of the reasons why the G20 continuously looks at this challenge of debt, because in so many respects we are seeing two worlds right now. Countries that can afford to borrow, countries that can afford to service their debts, and then countries with no fiscal space, where, as you just pointed out in our report, we are seeing interest payments now directly impacting the ability to invest in education, in healthcare, in social infrastructure. And it is this problem that is now really at the center of the attention trying to tackle debt issues, because not addressing, particularly for low-income countries that are most vulnerable, this issue right now means literally leaving them in paralysis. And that is a topic that the G20 has been grappling with for the better part of a year and a half now.
You and the UNDP advocates for what it calls a debt poverty pause to address this problem. What does that entail exactly?
Well, if you just imagine that in the last 3 years, we have had another 165 million additional people fall into poverty. In order to prevent that from happening, we would have needed to spend perhaps $14 billion to avoid this from happening. That's 0.009% of global GDP. Our problem is that our international financial architecture is not geared to helping countries that, through no fault of their own, often fall into situations of extreme economic and financial shock and constraints. Stepping in here with instruments that are more able to target the needs of countries, for example, through a debt or poverty pause or suspension, would allow countries to direct these resources specifically at the poorest in the society, at trying to stabilize education and health infrastructure systems. We saw it work during the COVID pandemic in many countries. Right now, 50 countries are a step away from defaulting. That means they are desperately looking for ways in which to not use their funds to pay interest rates, but rather to keep their economies going, particularly the social infrastructure.
In the longer term, one of the things that needs to happen is for restructuring processes to be able to go faster, to speed up. Janet Yellen said that the deal found last month between the various creditors of Zambia on Zambia's debt could be a blueprint going forward. What do you think of that?
Well, I very much agree with the Secretary, and I think everybody has celebrated that Zambia was able to conclude this deal. But let us also be clear that common framework has so far only enabled 4 countries in the world over the last 2 years to actually be included in such a deal. We have many more countries who are desperately looking for ways to dealing with their financing constraints. And I think the common framework needs to be complemented also by a return to debt suspension facility, because that is the reality of many developing countries, not the ones sitting around the G20 table right now. They're indeed seeing that their fiscal and monetary policy instruments are beginning to work to bring down inflation and ultimately also to return to a lower interest regime. But for low-income countries, that is not a prospect right now. And that is why, welcome as the deal with Zambia is, if we don't see many other countries being able to advance, this is not very meaningful. And that, I think, is the pressure. Not least also because, let us remember, 62% or more of global debt today is in fact private creditor held. This is a big difference to the past. It's also the private creditors that need to play a part in debt relief and debt restructuring.
Achim Steiner is the head of the United Nations Development Program. Thank you for being with us on France 24.